This is the first lecture in the Stratigraphy and Paleontology course through the University of South Florida. This is Sarah Sheffield, the instructor for the course. So today we're going to go over the stratigraphic principles. For a lot of you who have taken either History of Life or Dynamic Earth, this may be review, but that's okay because this is an incredibly important topic that will set the stage for a lot of what we'll have to think about coming or going through this course for the rest of the semester. If it's new to you, that's great. I am super glad we are here today and learning it. There are more slides attached with this presentation, so practice slides, essentially. I will put those on Canvas. We're not going to take the time to go through them here. They show you the basics of the applications of these, and if you have questions on that, I am more than happy to walk you through with them. Excuse me. All right, so this here is a picture of the Grand Canyon. And we see the different layers, right? So how do we know when each of these layers occurred? How do we know the Precambrian is down here? How do we know the Bright Angel Shale is Cambrian? How do we know the Hermit Shale is Permian? These are the types of questions we'll be able to answer in the next couple of lectures concerning stratigraphy. So there's some previous concepts that we won't go over in this class. If they're new to you, please feel free to come talk to me about them. But if you are pretty familiar with this, just review them real quick. Relative dating and absolute dating, what they are, how they're used, normal or reverse faults, and reading stratigraphic sequence diagrams. All right, so just like assigning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 when the orders of events happened. We'll be going through, those are things we're not really going to go through too much, and we'll just practice instead. All right, so this is the geologic timescale. Now, it looks pretty commonplace to us because this is something we've been looking at for a long time, right? So this image or, some variation of it has been shared with you a bunch of times in your geology classes. But have you ever stopped to think about how it was created and how much of an undertaking this must have been to make a global map of the ages of different rocks and fossils? It's absolutely wild to think about. So one thing that paleontology can always hang their hat on, essentially, you know what I mean? One thing that we can always be proud of is that the geologic timescale was really made because of fossils. So major changes in the geologic record is how we started to define different units of time. And we've since filled it in with other methods. But as you can see, the succession of fauna, that means the changes in animals through time, has really given us the ability to track when things were alive. So stratigraphy is the study of rock layers and layering. This can tell us age and spatial relationships. It can tell us compositions, origins, where different rocks come from. It allows us to say if rocks in China during a certain time are the same as rocks in Australia or rocks in Namibia. It's really a fantastic science. There's a whole bunch of different types of stratigraphy. I think there's something like 13 or 14 official branches, if I remember correctly. We're not going to go through all of those. We're going to go through the main ones. So lithostratigraphy, chemostratigraphy using chemicals, right? So chemical signatures in rocks to match up different rock layers. Biostratigraphy using fossils to match up different rock layers. So this is the official International CHRONOSTRATIGRAPHIC CHART. There's a couple things to point out here. One, it is so detailed. Now, I know I told you I was going to ask you to learn the geologic timescale. This is not what I'm asking you to learn, I promise. What we will be learning are the eons, the eras, the periods, and the epochs, but only of the Cenozoic. All right, so I'm not going to ask that you learn anything past that point. And then the major years that define the big transitions. So when the eons were and when the eras were. That's all, okay? So it's incredibly detailed. And if you notice, these numbers are very, very specific. So one thing to note too is that it says version 2018. There is a version 2020. It was released, I believe, like a week or two ago, put online. These are updated regularly with small changes to a lot of the numbers. You'll also notice that there's golden spikes in some particular areas. The golden spikes indicate a global boundary stratotype section, which can be kind of defined like the definition of of a time unit. All right. So when does that time unit start globally? So one more thing that I want you to point out here is, why are there so few back before the Phanerozoic? Now, the Phanerozoic is here. It means visible life, so that's really when hard-shelled fossils took off. And the reason there's so few is that there's very little to base the different layers on. The changes are much more subtle, right? We don't have dinosaurs all of a sudden appearing and then not there anymore. So it's really difficult to figure out when those distinctions occurred. So real quick, defining a stratotype. There is an International Commission on Stratigraphy. They meet regularly to discuss these types of things, and they decide on reference points for the bases of geologic stages. Once that base is ratified and accepted, it becomes a definition for the boundary, and all other new occurrences of the boundary have to refer back to the type section to see if they match. Fossils have a very similar pattern. We name a holotype, essentially the definition specimen, and we always refer back to the holotype to see if the fossil we have, the new one, fits the definition, or if we need to alter the taxonomy of the fossil, the name. So once it has been ratified, we will actually put a literal golden spike in the ground, right? So here's the ediacaran, the base, the stratotype, we have a golden spike right there. It was ratified in 2004. This is the only golden spike for the Precambrian. There's a couple things that we need to know. So first, GSSPs define the lower boundary, okay, not the upper. It will be marked by a primary marker and secondary markers. So primary markers are typically things like fossils, biostratigraphy, and then we have chemical or magnetic markers in support. So for example, a large carbon isotope excursion, or maybe a period of reverse polarity for chemical and magnetic stratigraphy in that order. We'll learn more about those in the upcoming lectures. The primary marker should be globally correlated, meaning if it only occurs once, well, that's not going to be really helpful for us, right? The marker needs to be facies independent, so it should occur in more than one depositional environment. We need to have radiometric minerals to get absolute dates, and the outcrop has to be thick enough to see what's going on with continuous sedimentation, no unconformities, and undeformed. So any form of metamorphic processes can alter our radiometric dating, so we can't have a lot of that going on. Last, which is kind of an interesting topic, and it's something we'll talk about a little bit during our discussion groups moving forward, is that the outcrop must be well maintained and freely accessible to researchers, both logistically and politically. Meaning, if there are geopolitical forces that don't allow scientists into a particular part of the world, it's really difficult to define a global GSSP, okay? And this has happened a lot throughout history, and it's likely not to change. So our story with stratigraphy really kicks off with a guy named Nicholas Steno, kind of the founder of stratigraphy. And his story in geology, because he kind of dabbled in a whole bunch of different things, began with a shark dissection. So, 1666, set the stage, all right? We know very little about rocks and fossils at this point. Most people think fossils are things that fell from the sky, or Aristotle was one of the first who thought that maybe fossils were remnants of living things. He thought fish swam into rocks and then turned into rocks themselves. So what fossils aren't super clear at this point. So in 1666, he dissects a shark. Here's his drawing of the shark. Horrifying creature, right? And he notices the teeth of the shark look so similar to things called tungstones. And tungstones, at the time, were rumored to be things that had fallen from the moon and sky. So what the heck is going on? Why would a shark have a mouthful of things that fell from the moon and sky? Well, they didn't, likely. He argued that tungstones were probably once shark's teeth and somehow had been worked into the rock layers. But how? Rock layers are solid. Rock layers don't change, right? So how in the world would these tungstones get inside the rocks? So that question is really what drove him to start looking into stratigraphy. His general conclusion was that rocks and minerals must have at one point in time been fluid. Things like tungstones could have been trapped in that fluid, and once the rock layers turned solid, they were just, along for the ride, and that's where we found them later. So that was the general idea. But it led him to this book, excuse me for going back for a second, this book where the laws of stratigraphy were founded, the things that we still use today to make our assumptions. So Steno's laws, there's a couple: superposition, original horizontality, lateral continuity, and cross-cutting relationships. Okay? Superposition, very simply, the oldest is on the bottom, the youngest is on the top. All right? So I start a weird habit, and I throw a newspaper into the same stack every single day of the year, right? And I love this. It's 2020. Come on, I've been locked in my house for months. You can't blame me, right? For those of you listening in future semesters, 2020 was rough. Okay, so superposition. Now let's say I have a cat, and cats are notorious for ruining things, right? So let's say this cat disturbs my newspaper pile, knocks it over, because why not? He's a cat. That would mess up my stratigraphy or my superposition, right? The assumption of superposition. And the same thing here. As long as it remains undisturbed, the oldest should be on the bottom, but faulting and folding could potentially mess that up. Here's an excellent example of something that has not been disturbed in terms of superposition. The oldest is still on the bottom. The Cliffs of Moher. So, original horizontality. Almost all rock layers are originally formed horizontally. So here is what they look like in originality. If there's any deformation, they can be changed. They can be folded, faulted, etc. In this case, maybe a magma plume push something up. I don't know, right? So again, these are very horizontal. Not a whole lot of changes occurred. Lateral continuity. Rocks form like what we see here on the left column in large, unbroken, flat expanses. Over time, things will erode the rocks down. So the Grand Canyon was once like this, and a river ran through it and cut a large canyon into it and eroded that material. You will learn through this semester that eroding material is a river's best and greatest talent in life. Okay? So here is the San Juan River in Utah. Absolutely beautiful, right? We can see that gorgeous layering, very horizontal, right? But this was at one point in time a flat, unbroken expanse of land, and a river has slowly eroded material through time, giving us this gorgeous canyon. Cross-cutting relationships. A geologic feature that cuts through another is the younger of two features. So there's a whole bunch of cross-cutting going on here. As we can see, we have B. This is a magma plume, all right? So B is cut by F. F must be younger, all right? F cuts through C. F is younger than C. So D here cuts through A and C, so it must be younger than A and C. However, it does not cut through E, meaning E is younger than D. Okay? So here is an example from Israel. We have this particular layer cutting through these horizontal layers. This here, this vertical piece, is the youngest. So James Hutton, continuing on with our discussion of dead guys here. So one thing to note is I'm not going to ask that you memorize any of their names. I'm sure you will know them just because we'll talk about them fairly frequently, but I'm not going to ask that you memorize their names here. He refined cross-cutting relationships and described unconformities. So this is Hutton's Unconformity in Scotland. It's a famous vacation spot for geologists. If you go there on any given day, probably not right now, of course, it's 2020, but if you go there, you will see lots of people reenacting the unconformities. Those are geologists in their natural habitat, okay? I sound like I'm judging, but I bet you all the money in the world that if I were given a plane ticket to Scotland, that's exactly what I would do, okay? So here is one layer of the rock, unconformity, all right? And there's the unconformity, and there's the other one. So do you see the two completely distinct layers? This is tilted one direction. This is tilted another direction completely, and there's a contact between them. So what an unconformity is missing time. Something happened here that was not recorded so that this large switch happened. There are two major types that we'll talk about here. We have an angular unconformity where one of the layers of rock is not happening horizontally. So one of them is happening at an angle, which is what we see here with this gorgeous anticline. All right, so here is the boundary right there between these two. Continuous unconformities mean everything is horizontal. So this is a beautiful photo from Yorkshire, England, but where is that unconformity line? It is right there. Now I'm going to take that away again. It's not really that noticeable. So one thing that we always have to be aware is it is possible unconformities may be there. Charles Lyell, he introduced the principle of inclusions. Now, Charles Lyell is a famous British scientist. He is well known for his extremely loud support of Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution by natural selection after Darwin published his controversial book, The On the Origin of Species. All right, but he was also quite famous in his own for geological interpretations. So the principle of inclusions can be summed up as clasts within a rock are older than the rock itself. So this insect is older than the amber that encases it. This conglomerate on the bottom, the clasts within the boulder itself are younger than the boulder. Another way to think about this is the chocolate chip cookie principle. The cookie formed around the pre-existing chips, right? Let's say we have chocolate chip cookie batter. We throw in the bag of Nestle's chocolate chips, and then we bake the cookies. So the cookies themselves are younger than the chocolate chips. It's a much more delicious way to think about geology. William Smith. We'll talk more about William Smith and his slightly unusual life, including some time spent in debtor's prison, but we'll talk about that during the biostratigraphy lecture. He introduced the principle of faunal succession, again, the change of animals through time. So this can be summed up here. Fossils contained in successive layers in rocks can be predictably patterned. So we can tell about where we are in the geologic record based on what type of fossil is there. So here are some lovely little trilobites. If I find a Phacops, I can tell I'm about in the Silurian-Devonian type range. And that, my friends, is how we get this gorgeous geologic timescale. Walther's law of facies. When environments are preserved in the rock record, they stack vertically. So this means when they are laterally extensive. So let's say we're sitting at the beach. We see the shore face. We see the upper shore face. We see the shore face. We see the shallow ocean moving into the slightly deeper ocean, moving out to the open ocean. Those are extending horizontally. In the rock record, they'll stack vertically on top of each other. And we'll talk about more of why this is when we get further into our conversations about stratigraphy. But because they stack vertically, we should be able to read them like a book, starting at the bottom, right, because of superposition, and ending at the top. Is there anything you have learned about today that might violate Walther's law of facies? Of course there is. We just learned about unconformities. Unconformities are missing time. So to put this in more of a book-type scenario here, let's say we're all reading Harry Potter. And if you haven't read Harry Potter, come on now. The books are older than... I don't want to think about that because it's just going to hurt my feelings. I'm old. Okay, so the books here are, let's say you open the book and you're like, Harry's a wizard. And then boom, Voldemort's back. And you're like, what the heck happened? Okay, this was clearly not a well-written book. And then you're like, 200 pages are missing. Excellent. All right, that would be like an unconformity. So we need to make sure we know where those unconformities are. And this helps us figure out the general order in which the layers were formed, folded, and faulted. Okay, so this is relative dating. And it leads us into lithostratigraphy, using features of rock layers to perform geologic correlations. It allows us to identify gaps or unconformities in the rock record, and it gives us mappable units where we can track these changes across large areas. Here is a lithostratigraphic correlation map of Florida. All right, so all these different colors correspond to different ages, and we can see the cross sections here. So Florida is, and I'm so sorry to say this, very boring geologically to me, okay? And the reason for that is it's incredibly young. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on in Florida, don't get me wrong, but there's not a whole lot of lithostratigraphic variation. Now what is there is pretty cool. Like we've got the Anastasia Formation over here, which is this beautiful limestone that makes really cool cut patterns across the way because of the waves, and there's some other types of stratigraphy up there. Okay, but it's all extremely young. It's all Cenozoic. Using these correlated strat columns, we can see variations in lithology, variations in rock types, and that can tell us a lot about the changing environments through time. So, for example, if we start to see more prevalence of coal popping up, we could say, oh, I wonder if it's becoming a swampy environment. Or if we see coarse sandstone popping up everywhere that's really beautifully rounded, we can be like, man, I wonder if that's a beach face. Okay? So it can tell us a lot about changing environments, which is just a super cool thing. Now we can correlate units globally as long as we know what each name means. And this is where stratigraphy gets both fun and a little bit painful. All right. So as you can imagine, stratigraphy has been done long before the internet and long before there was global talk about different units. All right. So we have names for things that don't necessarily match up globally. For a good example, there is the Cincinnatian age. Now that is a regional age. It's based out of Cincinnati. I'm sure you guessed it. Of course, the Cincinnatian really doesn't mean much to people in Spain. Now they have one called the Caesar Augustan. Okay, and I know I'm saying that wrong, and I'm so sorry, but it's the Caesar Augustan, and it is named for Caesar, obviously. But that doesn't necessarily match up exactly with the Cincinnatian, although they're in the same range of each other. All right, so I may be wrong on that. I'll have to look up the Caesar Augustan, but it doesn't matter from here, okay? So the Cincinnatian doesn't correlate globally, it correlates regionally. So we have to use units that correlate globally in papers so that everybody, whether they are in Zimbabwe or Mongolia or Russia, know exactly what we mean by this. This is why the International Chronostratigraphic Chart is so important. So here are the units that I'm going to expect you to know. The Hadean is cut off, so sorry about that, but the Hadean, Archaic, Proterozoic, those are the eons within the Precambrian. Then we have the Paleozoic, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian. All right, the Carboniferous can be broken down into two units, the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. We'll get there. The Mesozoic, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and then the Cenozoic, Paleogene, Neogene, Quaternary. Here is a fun mnemonic device that can go with this. All right. If you learn best by mnemonic devices, have at it. Make your own or use this one. So again, as I said, the Carboniferous can be broken into two pieces, the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. These are the North American units. They are not the international units. So this is something to remember, okay? So in the international, it's broken into the lower and upper Carboniferous, the lower being the Mississippian, or upper being the Pennsylvanian. U.S. maps use the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian, so you do need to know it, but you should know that the whole unit is just called the Carboniferous everywhere else, okay? So, a note on upper and lower. There's also something called early and late, and a lot of people use this interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable. If you are referring to the time that the rocks represent, or the time the fossils in the rocks represent, you call it early or late. For example, echinoderms lived in the late Cambrian, okay? If you're referring to the actual rocks, it's lower or upper. Some echinoderms are found in upper Cambrian rocks. Make sense? So the easy way to remember this is time runs early and late. You can be running early and late. You can't run upper and lower. That makes no sense, okay? So early and late with capitals and upper and lower with capital letters means something entirely different than when they're not capitalized. And the difference between that is important. If it is capitalized, it means it's an official term, meaning you can go back to the geologic timescale and you can see it. If it's not capitalized, or if it's not there, it's just a general descriptor. So if I were to go back to the geologic timescale, there is nothing that says lower Cambrian on it. meaning the lower Cambrian is just a relative unit or a relative time chunk on the time scale. So I could say lowercase lower Cambrian rocks. In retrospect, in the Carboniferous here, we have the upper and lower Carboniferous, which are official units, or the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian, all those are official units. You would use capital letters to describe those, okay? So if you see it written on the time scale, then they're capital letters. If you don't, they're not capital. So the Cenozoic epochs, the only reason I'm going to ask that you learn this because you live in Florida and you're going to see a lot of it, all right? So the Paleogene, Neogene, Quaternary can be split into the Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, Holocene, possibly the Anthropocene. We'll talk about why that's possible here in just a little bit, in a couple weeks from now. But the Anthropocene is essentially what people describe as the geologic time unit where humans are changing the geologic record, like through plastic trash and things like that. Okay. So just like fossils, we have to name and identify certain packages of rocks. So just for example, like T-Rex has to have a name, right? T-Rex, you can all envision T-Rex for me, Tyrannosaurus Rex, the giant short-armed, weird-looking dinosaur, okay? That gets way too much fame. I'm just going to say it, okay? So a formation is distinctive enough that a geologic mapper can tell it apart from surrounding rock layers. It has to be thick and extensive enough to find it on a map. That is a formation. So here is a formation, the Entrada sandstone. It's this gorgeous, gorgeous red layered sandstone here. It is red because of all the iron in it. Over top of it is the Curtis, the Somerville, and finally the Morrison Formation, which is my personal favorite because it's got a lot of cool fossils in it. Formations are divided into members. Members are divided into beds. Many formations can make up a group, and many groups can make up a supergroup. So it's kind of like a Russian nesting doll type situation here, okay? So kind of similar to our taxonomy that you may have learned in biology class: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? Species, multiple of them will make up a genus, which will make up a family, etc. As you all know, geology is not something that we can fit into cute little boxes like this, so it's not necessarily straightforward, but this is the general idea. All right,